Um, Edmund and Sylvia Morris lived 2 or 3 blocks away from Maria Rana and I on Capitol Hill in the late 1990s. I learned something very important and new about Edmund from his own mouth this morning, that it is thanks solely to the efforts of Edmund Morris, taken directly to Don Graham, that the comic strip Zippy was restored to the Washington Post. You also may not know that Edmund is as much a conservationist as his great subject, Theodore Roosevelt. And once, many years ago, there was a tree in front of Edmund and Sylvia's house on 2nd Street that the city of Washington was determined to cut down. And Edmund was so determined that it not be cut down that he climbed the tree and wrapped his arms around it and said, "Shoot if you must this old gray head, but spare my favorite tree," he said. Edmund really does not need an introduction. He has now concluded, after more than 3 decades' work, one of the monumental biographical studies in American literature. The 3rd volume of his Theodore Roosevelt is, of course, Colonel Roosevelt, which covers a protracted and difficult, at times painful period in Theodore Roosevelt's life when he missed the bully pulpit of the presidency, missed being the center of everybody's attention, was touring the world, was running into serious illness, suffered great personal losses. It's a dramatic story. Nobody tells this story better than Edmund Morris, and it's really my great pleasure to introduce my old friend.
That's completely untrue about me climbing the tree. I tried to and went skidding back to ground level. After that incident, which surprised even me, here am I, a 55-year-old guy, as I was then, hugging this tree in a passion of protectiveness. I'd never felt that way about a tree before. Before that, I tended to agree with Ronald Reagan. If you'd seen one redwood, you've seen them all. But the sight and sound of that buzzsaw biting into the boughs of this great pine tree outside our house just awoke something atavistic in me, and the next thing I know, I'm out there in my socks, 7 o'clock in the morning, hugging the tree, preventing its destruction. Well, of course, I did not succeed. The tree actually belonged to the building next door, and they had every right to cut it down. So I had to retreat back into my house and listen to the rest of the destruction of that tree, feeling just about worse than I've ever felt in my life, and astonished at the intensity of my own feelings. Wrote an article about it for the New York Times, and some months later I happened to be talking about the incident to Howard Nemeroff, the great American poet. And he said, "You know, I once wrote a poem about the destruction of a tree at the bottom of our driveway." And he said, "Of all the thousands of poems I've written in my life, that was the one which generated the most response." There is something fundamental about the destruction of a great tree that affects us all very powerfully. I don't know if any of you remember that in Germany in the 1980s, the Black Forest suffered a strange period of angst where trees were dying off by the million, some mysterious disease that nobody could comprehend. The thought was that it had something to do with environmental pollution, automobile fumes, and so on. But what was interesting was that during this period of the self-destruction of the Black Forest, there was a quantum increase in cases of clinical depression all across Germany. The Black Forest eventually recovered, and the incidences of psychological depressions went down. And when you consider the German people have this ancestral, mythological memory of Die Wald, the forest, the woods, where the gods lived. And when they felt that their mythological history was being destroyed, they felt that they were being destroyed themselves as a people. All of which has nothing too much to do with biography, but, well, I guess it does. Because Theodore Roosevelt, as I'm sure most of you know, was the first and the greatest of our conservationist presidents. When he became president in 1901, the word conservation could be found in American dictionaries, but it did not have the meaning that we now associate it with. It was T.R. who put conservation with a capital C on the map, into the dictionaries, and the concept of conservation into the American mind. He was the one, as president, who made the American people realize that our natural resources, our inventory of natural resources, was being depleted at a frightening rate, that 50% of the forest that Columbus saw, or at least whoever got here first saw, had already gone. And it was he who in 1908, in I think his single greatest stroke of statesmanship, assembled the first White House Conservation Conference of Governors, brought all the chief executives of all the states together with men of science and men of intellect to compile an inventory of the national resources and a method of philosophy of protecting these resources for the children and the children's children of everybody alive in the country at that time. When he left the White House in March of 1909, conservation had become such an important topic that a World Conservation Conference was planned to take place in the White House 2 or 3 years after he left office. And he handed the agenda of this conference over to his successor, William Howard Taft, who couldn't have cared less about the subject and allowed it to die, and that conference never happened. However, when we do look back on TR now, 100 years later, I think that is the one achievement of his presidency that we should revere and remember as seminal. It's something of a homecoming to me to come to this particular stretch of turf and to be in the proximity of this particular castle, the Smithsonian Castle, because I came here in the year 1983, long before any of you were born. Why are you laughing? As a fellow of the Wilson Institute, the Wilson Center for Scholars, which used to be headquartered here in the castle. I was a fellow for 3 months, and that's where I began my second Roosevelt biography, Theodore Rex. It's the first time that I'd ever been in an academic environment amongst fellow scholars from all over the world, and I must confess that I felt very strange in the company of these cerebral guys with long strings of degrees after their names. I was given the study in the tallest of the towers you'll see outside, right up the top with immense Gothic windows, looking out over the Mall, the Mall. And the first evening I spent there feeling very strange, I was disturbed by the most extraordinary screaming in the corridor outside. It sounded like a knife fight in the New York subway. So I rushed out of my office and said to the professor who was in an office opposite me, "Is somebody being killed? What do we do? Do we call the police?" He said, "Don't worry, it's a pair of Renaissance scholars. Don't mix with those guys." That was my introduction to the lethal world of academe.